You've driven past the Adirondacks and thought, nice lakes, some trees, a quiet corner of New York. But you weren't really looking. Out on one dead-end road, the Vanderbilts built a whole campus of log mansions and disguised it as a rustic cabin. Deep in the high peaks, one man ran a settlement of exactly one person until a single storm drove him out. And some of these postcard-perfect canoe lakes turned so acidic the fish vanished. This isn't just scenery, it's a still-rising billion-year-old dome, a state-sized experiment, an inhabited wilderness. And almost nobody driving through knows what it's really hiding. 35 facts about the Adirondacks that sound fake, but everyone is real. 35. The ghost town of Tahawus. Follow Upper Works Road to its dead end, out near the raw headwaters of the Hudson, and the pavement opens onto something no map warns you about, an entire abandoned company town. This is Tahawus. Businessmen Archibald McIntyre and David Henderson founded it in 1826 after finding iron ore on the Upper Hudson, building the Adirondack Iron Works and a village then called Adirondack. The iron ran out and the town died in 1857. Then, National Lead came back for the titanium in the ore, rebuilt the village, and by 1945, it held about 84 buildings. They pulled roughly 40 million tons of ore out of the ground before the mine closed for good in 1989. What's left now is a stone blast furnace rising over the spruce, boarded houses, collapsing porches, 2 centuries of labor going quietly back to forest. The furnace alone is enormous. Stone arches and a slag-crusted interior looming over a street of empty homes, all of it silent. And you can walk right up to it. Nobody's stopping you. 34. Mount Marcy hides the Hudson's source. You picture the Hudson River starting as a broad, working waterway somewhere near Albany or New York Harbor. Its first drops actually seep out of a boggy little pond near the top of New York's highest mountain. It's called Lake Tier of the Clouds, a tea-colored tarn at about 4,293 feet on the shoulder of Mount Marcy, which itself tops out at 5,344 feet. Water leaves the tarn into Feldspar Brook, then the Opalescent River, then the Upper Hudson, and finally runs 315 miles to the sea, past Albany's ports and Manhattan's skyscrapers. That's roughly the drive from these peaks all the way to Washington, D.C., powered by nothing but rain and gravity. There's a strange footnote, too. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was near Marcy in 1901 when word came that President McKinley was dying, and he started the frantic trip out to become president. A quiet mountain puddle, and one of America's most storied rivers begins right there. 33. Santa's Workshop at the North Pole. On NY 86 near Wilmington, in a hamlet literally named North Pole, sits one of the oldest theme parks in America, and almost nobody outside the region has heard of it. Santa's Workshop opened July 1st, 1949, dreamed up by Lake Placid designer Arto Monaco years before Disneyland existed. It was built at child scale, tiny storybook streets, toy shop fronts, a permanent Santa's house, and live reindeer in pens out back. In the 1950s and 60s, it drew regional bus tours and got written up in travel magazines as a pioneering attraction. Most people assume a vintage American theme park means Orlando or Anaheim. This one's been running for more than 75 years, longer than It's a Wonderful Life has been on television. Tucked into a working mountain valley under the 4,867-foot summit of Whiteface. It never grew coasters or crowds. It stayed small and family-owned, a mid-century Christmas village woven right into an ordinary Adirondack town. There's a mailbox out front marked North Pole, and yes, real letters actually go there. 32. The highway to the top of Whiteface. Most Adirondack summits make you earn them. Miles of rock and route. Whiteface, one of the highest peaks in the park, hands you a road instead. The Veterans Memorial Highway climbs about 5 miles up the mountain's flank from Wilmington, built as a Depression-era public works project and dedicated to veterans in 1935. It ends just below the 4,867-foot summit at a stone castle. From there, it gets stranger. You walk through a tunnel roughly 426 feet into the mountain to an elevator, and the elevator lifts you the last stretch to within steps of the top. Drive, tunnel, elevator, summit. On a clear day, the terraces open onto the whole high peaks, Lake Placid, and Vermont's Green Mountains across the water. To a driver, it feels like just another scenic byway, until the road delivers you into a castle bolted to the roof of the Adirondacks. It's one of the only drive-up mountain summits anywhere in the entire Northeast. No other high peak lets you do that. 31. The coldest towns in the East. Saranac Lake and Old Forge look like any small northeastern main streets. Diner, hardware store, church. NOAA and state climate records tell a colder story. These towns routinely post some of the lowest temperatures in the entire eastern United States, colder than cities well to the north. And they're not perched on some peak. Saranac Lake sits around 1,545 feet. Old Forge about 1,629. The trick is geography. They sit in bowls ringed by higher ground. So on clear winter nights, dense Arctic air drains downhill and pools in the valley, slow to mix back out. Saranac Lake averages a January low near 4 degrees Fahrenheit and has dropped below -30. Old Forge has recorded below -40, colder than a home freezer. Then another 40 degrees on top. Locals just adapt. Saranac Lake has thrown a winter carnival, ice palace and all, since the 1890s. An ordinary-looking town, sitting in one of the harshest microclimates in the East. 30. The dome that's still rising. Everyone lumps the Adirondacks in with the Appalachians. Same worn-down eastern hills. Geologists don't. This is a dome, a roughly circular block of crust pushed up from below, with the oldest rock exposed dead center. That core is Grenville-age basement rock, more than 1 billion years old, once buried under younger layers and then lifted back into daylight. Here's the part that unsettles people. The Adirondacks aren't finished. Re-leveling surveys show the dome is still rising today, about 0.15 inches a year near its center, roughly a foot per century. Since the 1932 Lake Placid Olympics, the middle of this range has climbed the height of a single stair step. What's pushing it up is still debated. One leading idea is a pillow of hot, low-density mantle rock swelling underneath. From the trail, it reads as calm spruce ridges and glacial valleys. Underfoot is a billion-year-old block of crust that's actively growing. The mountains around it are worn out. This one's still on its way up. That's fact 30. Quick thing before we keep going. Honestly, the comments on these videos are the best part. If I've missed something about the Adirondacks, something only a local would know, put it down there. I read all of them. Okay, where were we? 29. The park that's really water. From the road, the Adirondacks read as one endless wall of forest. Pull back on a map, and the trees turn out to be hiding water. A lot of it. Inside the park boundary sit roughly 2,800 lakes and ponds, and around 30,000 miles of rivers and streams. Line those waterways up end to end, and you'd wrap the equator about 1¼ times. Most of it isn't the famous postcard lakes at all. It's glacial kettle ponds with no inlet or outlet, marsh chains, and beaver-dammed creeks, carved and left behind when the last ice sheet melted off about 12,000 years ago. In the St. Regis Canoe area, dozens of small ponds link up with short carries between them, so you can travel for days by paddle where there's barely a road. For the guides who worked here, water was often the faster way through. What looks like solid woods is really a vast, branching web of quiet water. 28. Loons on the vacation lakes. You assume that eerie, wavering loon call is a rare wilderness prize, something you'd have to paddle days to hear. In the Adirondacks, it's the sound of an ordinary summer evening off a rental dock. The park is the heart of New York's loon population. The Wildlife Conservation Society estimates 600 to 850 breeding pairs across these waters. Back in 1988, the count was only 216 to 270 pairs, so the birds have climbed steadily since. That's why lakes where families rent kayaks and cabins, Tupper, Lower Saranac, Garnet, often hold territorial adults, floating chicks, and loons crash diving for fish in plain view. They need real habitat to pull it off. A loon needs a lake of at least about 25 acres just to get airborne. That overlap with people is the catch too. Lead fishing tackle and boat wakes are the everyday threats. So the wildest sound in the North Woods turns out to be your next-door neighbor for the summer. 27. The village that hosted the Olympics twice.
The Winter Olympics feel like they belong to big cities and enormous budgets. One of the most storied host sites is a mountain village that had fewer than 4,000 people. Lake Placid staged the Winter Games not once, but twice. In 1932 and again in 1980, the first Winter Olympics ever held in North America. Governor Franklin Roosevelt opened the 1932 Games in person, and a local speed skater, Jack Shea, won 2 golds on an outdoor oval on Main Street. Nearly 50 years later, the village hosted again, adding the rink where the U.S. team pulled off the Miracle on Ice. Staging the games here was like holding the Super Bowl in a high school football town, and the venues never left. Drive the wooded roads around town today, and you come across the bobsled run carved into the hillside at Mount Van Hovenberg, and the ski jumps rising straight out of the trees. Still active, still training athletes. 26. The Pale Rock on the Peaks. Climb a high peak like Marcy or Whiteface, and the summit rock isn't the dark, tree-covered stuff of most eastern ridges. It's pale, light gray to almost white, bare and wind-scoured. That's a northocite, a plagioclase-rich rock that crystallized deep in the crust about 1.1 billion years ago, during the same Grenville event that built the dome's basement. Most people figure all northeast mountains are basically the same rock. These aren't. Marcy stands 5,344 feet, Whiteface 4,867, and both are capped in this pale stone. A northocite is hard and slow to weather, so when Ice Age glaciers scraped the soil off these summits, the stone stayed bare, and it has ever since, with lichens and alpine plants clinging into the cracks. The pale caps do something else too. They give these peaks wide open views that forested summits never get, and on a sunny day, the rock throws the light right back at you. A different mountain, made of different stone, hiding on the same horizon.
25. The wilderness that was clear-cut. That deep primeval forest around Rich Lake near Newcomb. The kind that feels like it's never been touched. Most of it was cut to the ground. Logging in the Adirondacks began by 1803 and exploded through the 1820s, feeding downstream mills with softwood for lumber and pulp. By the mid-1800s, river drives were floating cut timber out of these uplands on the Hudson and the Raquette. What grew back is second growth, even-aged stands of spruce, fir, and hardwood, most of the trees under 150 years old, instead of the ragged, multi-age structure of true old growth. The reason it recovered at all is a legal one. New York created the Forest Preserve in 1885 and locked in Forever Wild in 1894, halting most large-scale cutting on state land. Naturalists from the college campus at Newcomb still walk visitors to cut stumps, old skid roads, and decaying corduroy trails hidden inside the wilderness. The forest that feels ancient is really a working landscape that got a second life. 24. What Adirondack actually means. The name is on every brown boundary sign, every chair, every license plate frame, and it started as an insult. It traces to a Mohawk word, roughly bark eaters or they eat trees, a jab aimed at Algonquian neighbors who didn't farm and, in hard winters, were said to strip and eat tree bark. It shows up as early as 1635, spelled Adirondacks, in a Mohawk Dutch glossary written by a Dutch trader traveling through Mohawk country. For 2 centuries, it stayed an ethnonym, not a place. Then, in 1838, a state geologist named Ebenezer Emmons pinned it onto the mountains themselves. The Mohawk had their own name for this high country, Siononteskowa, Big Mountains. Most visitors assume Adirondack is just a pretty invented word for a wilderness brand. It's actually a repurposed slur, sitting quietly on 6 million acres of signage. The sources flag the exact etymology as debated. Bark eater is the strongest reading, not the only one, but that sharp edge is real. 23. Private land, wilderness rules. Buy a chunk of forest inside the Adirondack Park, and you might assume you can do what any rural landowner does. Subdivide it, build on it, log it however you like. Not here. Nearly half the park is privately owned, but since the 1973 land use plan, that private land is zoned by the Adirondack Park Agency into categories most owners have never heard of. The strictest is called resource management. According to a Yale Law Journal analysis, 53% of the park's private land is capped at just 15 new buildings per square mile, one house for every 43 acres, roughly 32 football fields of forest per cabin. Drop all of Central Park into such a tract, and you'd be allowed about 20 buildings on the whole thing. Build a new home within a quarter-mile of a designated river, and you likely need an agency permit, even though it's your land. That invisible rulebook is why so much private backcountry still looks and stays wild. 22. The moose that came back on their own. Ask most people where to find a moose, and they'll say Maine or Canada, anywhere but New York. Moose were wiped out of the Adirondacks by the early 1900s, hunted out and starved out as logging stripped the young forests they feed on. Nobody brought them back. Starting mid-century, moose simply walked in on their own, dispersing west out of recovering Vermont forests, across the Blue Line, into the northern Adirondack wetlands. By the 1980s, the sightings were trickling in, loggers and drivers on remote roads like Route 3 reporting big dark shapes browsing saplings at dawn. In 2015, the state started fitting them with GPS collars. The population now runs around 700 across northern New York. They're fully protected. No hunting season, though winter ticks and car collisions take a toll along that 60-mile stretch of Route 3. Spread across the park, that's about one moose per 15,000 acres. An animal for an area bigger than Manhattan. They came home on their own, and most visitors never notice. 21. The fire towers watching empty sky. Follow a narrow path to the top of Hurricane Mountain or St. Regis, and you step out onto a steel fire tower. And it's not a modern cell mast. It's a hand-built lookout from a system that no longer exists. In the 1910s and 1920s, New York strung steel towers across key Adirondack summits to watch for wildfire smoke, replacing the earlier wooden ones. An observer sat in the cramped cab 30 to 40 feet up, about 4 stories over the summit scrub, scanning for plumes and phoning in bearings before airplanes were around to do it. Each tower had a keeper's cabin nearby. You can still find the low stone foundations. By the 1960s and 70s, aerial patrols and lightning detection made the towers obsolete, and many came down. Then local groups and the state restored a handful, Hurricane and St. Regis among them, for hikers. So the same tiny cab that once guarded millions of acres of forest now hands you a 360-degree view, and nothing left to report. 20. The boat built for this place alone. Everyone calls the Adirondacks canoe country. On the classic lake chains, though, the real workhorse wasn't a canoe at all. It was a rowboat found almost nowhere else on Earth. The Adirondack guideboat took shape in the 1840s in shops around Long Lake, where guides faced a maddening landscape. Short stretches of water, maybe 5 miles at a run, broken up by land you had to cross on foot. So builders like Warren Cole designed a double-ended rowing boat about 16 feet long that weighed only around 60 pounds, light enough to flip onto your shoulders and carry between ponds. Yet with its closely spaced spruce ribs and thin planking, that featherweight hull could haul close to 1,000 pounds of passengers, gear, and game. That's a boat carrying more than 16 times its own weight. A museum curator once called it probably the most important indigenous watercraft of the Adirondacks. It isn't a canoe, it's a purpose-built machine, and these lakes are the whole reason it exists. 19. The Ice Age fingerprints in every valley. Camp beside Avalanche Lake, that narrow slot of water walled by cliffs between Colden and Avalanche Mountain, and you're sitting inside a machine's leftovers. During the last glaciation, ice lobes ground south out of the Laurentide sheet through this corridor, thick enough to gouge the old stream valley into a steep-sided, U-shaped trough. When the ice pulled back around 12,000 years ago, it left the basin holding Avalanche Lake at about 2,854 feet, cliff walls rising more than 1,000 feet straight up, as tall as the Eiffel Tower. The polished, scratched rock above the water and the house-sized boulders scattered along the shore are glacial signatures, dumped far from any ledge they'd match. Most hikers read it as mountains plus a lake. It's really the frozen imprint of ice a mile deep. And the same story repeats. Johns Brook, the Ausobel Valleys, even Little Lake Tear of the Clouds all sit in basins the ice carved and then walked away from. 18. When guiding was a working-class trade. Before any of this was a vacation, being an Adirondack guide was a hard rural job, like being a mason or a teamster. Around Raquette Lake and the Fulton Chain, by the mid-1800s, wealthy sports from New York and Boston were paying local men to run their multi-week hunting and fishing trips. A guide like the famed Mitchell Sabattis would row the guideboat, portage the gear, pitch the camp or build a log shanty, cook the meals, find the game, and keep everyone alive. Engagements ran 2 to 6 weeks a party, and in a cash-poor place, that steady pay anchored whole lakefront families. Guides kept logbooks of their trips and memorized named guide routes, water and carry combinations passed down by heart. A lot of those logbooks now sit in the museum at Blue Mountain Lake. And here's the part that lingers. Much of the wild trail and carry network people hike today didn't start as recreation. It started as somebody's workplace, mapped by the men who made a living in it.
17. The Subarctic, hiding behind the shoreline.
Step off a busy lake landing north of Saranac Lake, and, within a few yards, the ground can start to move under you. That's Bloomingdale Bog, hundreds of acres of peatland and floating sphagnum mat that the state maps as a significant natural community. Over roughly 10,000 years since the ice left, moss built peat thick enough to float on open water, making a quaking surface that trembles when you walk it. And the plants growing there don't belong to a temperate forest at all. Carnivorous pitcher plants and sundews that trap insects, bog cranberry, stunted black spruce, and tamarack. It's a fragment of subarctic Canada set down in New York, and most people paddle right past it. Everyone calls a wet spot a swamp. Ecologists will tell you these are true bogs and fens, sorted by their water chemistry, and that difference is the whole point, because it's what lets far northern species survive this far south. Soft ground, strange leaves, colder air, a few yards off the postcard. 16. The death that named a brook. In September 1845, a Scottish-born ironmaster named David Henderson knelt by a small pond deep in the high peaks to scout a dam site for his mining works. He set his pistol down, or it slipped. The accounts differ, and it fired, and it killed him. Henderson was the driving force behind the ironworks at Upper Works, the operation that would become Tahawus. His companions, stunned, named the water on the spot Calamity Pond, and the stream running out of it, Calamity Brook. Those names stuck. They're printed on USGS maps today, and thousands of hikers walk the Calamity Brook Trail toward Lake Coldest every year, with no idea they're following a dead man's memorial. You'd assume a name that grim was just old backwoods legend. It isn't. It's a specific, dated, documented accident, preserved in company letters and mapped onto the land. Henderson's death helped push the failing ironworks toward collapse, and, decades later, toward the titanium mine that finally emptied the town. 15. The hermit who built a town of one. Noah John Rondo was born in 1883. And for about 20 years, he lived alone on the Cold River, deep in the western high peaks, in a place he named Cold River City, population 1. He was not a myth. He built a cluster of little huts, put up hand-lettered signs, called himself the mayor, and filled diaries in his own private cipher that people are still working to fully crack. And he wasn't unreachable either. Hunters, hikers, and reporters came in by canoe and trail to meet the famous hermit, because he'd become a genuine minor celebrity. He hunted, trapped, fished, and guided to get by. What finally drove him out wasn't loneliness or age. It was a single storm. The Great Blowdown of 1950 flattened huge swaths of forest and wrecked his Cold River home. He was 67, and he never returned to the river. The corridor is still there on the map, quiet and empty. It once had a mayor. 14. The waist-high forest on top. Reach the top of a high peak like Marcy, and the trees shrink into something out of the far north. Spruce and fir twisted into knee and waist-high mats you could nearly step over. That's Krummholz, German for crooked wood, and people write it off as just wind damage. It's really geology and climate working together. These summits are that hard, slow weathering. 1.1 billion-year-old anorthosite again, which gives up almost no deep soil, So roots are trapped in a thin skin of ground that dries out fast and gets scoured by wind and ice. A tree that would grow 80 feet in the valley survives up here only by hugging the ground, staying below the worst of the wind. The result looks subarctic, even though you're at the latitude of southern New England. It's also fragile. These alpine mats cover a tiny footprint, and a single boot off the rock can kill plants that took decades to grow, which is exactly why the signs up there beg you to walk only on bare stone. 13. The homeland under the empty wilderness. The whole Forever Wild story quietly implies the Adirondacks were empty before the state stepped in to save them. They weren't. The National Park Service traces human presence here back thousands of years, to the Paleo-Indian period. The Mohawk and Oneida hold the mountains as part of their territory. The Algonquian-speaking Mohican claimed the country east of Lake George toward Lake Champlain. It's true few built permanent villages in the high interior, but it was hunting ground, travel corridor, and, as European settlement pushed in, a refuge people retreated into. And that presence isn't only history. In 2025, the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center bought a 600-acre property in Onchioda for $1.1 million, joining it to 330 acres they already held, about 900 acres now, close to a square mile and a half, set aside for a Haudenosaunee gathering place and a youth camp. The land marketed for a century as pristine and peopleless turns out to be homeland, and native communities are actively buying pieces of it back. 12. Pockets of Canada in the lowlands. Walk the Boreal Life Trail at Paul Smith's, a 1.6-mile loop, and within minutes, you cross out of ordinary hardwood forest into a cold, shaded spruce bog. Black spruce, balsam fir, sphagnum, and boreal birds like the gray jay and boreal chickadee that most birders chase all the way to northern Canada. You'd think that kind of far north habitat only survives way up high on the summits. In the Adirondacks, it's the opposite. The best boreal habitat is down in the low, wet flats. Cold air pools in these hollows, peat holds the moisture, snow lingers, and a near boreal community hangs on at mid-latitude New York. The Racket Boreal Complex alone protects nearly 25,000 acres of this lowland forest, about 39 square miles, bigger than the city of Syracuse. Scientists now treat these pockets as climate refuges, cold islands that could shelter northern species as everything around them warms. A short detour off a warm trail, and you've stepped hundreds of miles north. 11. The Vanderbilt's Rustic Kingdom. At the end of a dirt road on Racket Lake, the trees open onto something that's emphatically not a cabin. Great Camp Sagamore, a whole lakeside campus of log buildings built for the Vanderbilt family in the 1890s. This was one of the Adirondack Great Camps, and the trick was deliberate. From the outside, everything looks rough-hewn and frontier simple. Bark, logs, broad porches. Behind the scenes, it ran like a private resort, with boathouses, service buildings, and a small army of staff quartered on site to keep Gilded Age life humming in the middle of the woods. That contradiction is the whole design. Engineer the appearance of wilderness while enjoying every comfort of the city. Most people picture the early camps as one-room hunting shacks. Some were dozens of buildings pretending to be shacks. It's a National Historic Landmark now, and you can walk the grounds. A manufactured wilderness that shows you exactly how the Adirondacks became the place the very rich went to feel rustic. We're into the final 10 now, and the biggest ideas are still ahead. If you've made it this far, the hardest part is over. The last few don't just add to the list, they reframe everything that came before them. 10. The rarest songbird you'll walk right past. Climb through the band of stunted spruce and fir near the top of a high peak, and you may pass one of the rarest breeding birds in the eastern United States without a clue. The Bicknell's thrush breeds almost nowhere on Earth except cool, wet mountaintops in the northeast and eastern Canada, mostly above about 3,500 feet. In the Adirondacks, that means a thin ribbon of habitat right at the summits of Marcy, Whiteface, and Coldest, a strip often only a few hundred vertical feet tall before the trees give out to bare rock. Birders travel a long way and hike at dawn just to catch its spiraling, flute-like song carrying through the fog. Spread across the park's 6 million acres, its habitat is barely a scatter of postage stamps. You assume the birds up top are the same robins and chickadees from your backyard. A few of them are global rarities, packed into the one fragile band of trees the summit will allow. 9. The railroads swallowed by the forest. That oddly straight, oddly level trail you're following through thick woods along the Raquette River may not be a trail at all. It's a railroad grade. From the 1890s into the 1920s, lumber companies drove private railroads deep into these forests to haul out timber and pulpwood, running log trains from crude sidings on the river flats to mills at Tupper Lake. They were built cheap. Narrow earthen grades 10 to 20 feet wide, wooden trestles thrown over the bogs, and meant to last only until the nearby timber was gone. When trucks took over in the 1920s and 30s, the crews pulled the rails and walked away. The forest did the rest. In places like the Five Ponds and Pepperbox wildernesses, you can still find rotting trestle abutments over backcountry streams and rail beds running dead straight for miles into old cutovers. One spur could run 20 miles, the distance from Tupper Lake to Saranac Lake. What reads as untouched wilderness was, within a single lifetime, an industrial rail yard. 8. A park the size of a state. Glance at a state map and the Adirondacks look like a cluster of mountains in New York's corner. Then you learn what the boundary actually contains. The park runs about 6 million acres, roughly the size of the whole state of Vermont, and far bigger than the famous national parks. You could drop Yellowstone and Yosemite inside it together and still have room to spare. That boundary, the blue line, was first drawn in 1892, and it doesn't just wrap peaks. It swallows lowland rivers, farm valleys, and entire towns. Drive from Old Forge in the south to Malone in the north, and you can cover 120, 150 miles and never once leave a single park. Most people file the Adirondacks under mountain range. It's really a state-scale mosaic of forest, water, and settlement, held inside one line on a map, the largest park of its kind in the lower 48, and it barely registers as a park to the people driving through it. 7. The wilderness that pays its taxes. Almost everywhere in America, public land pays no local property tax. It's a blank space on the town rolls. The Adirondacks flipped that back in 1886, when New York agreed to pay full local property taxes on its own forest preserve land here. That's genuinely strange, the state taxing itself, like any private landowner, on land it can never sell or develop. And the money is real. Protect the Adirondacks calculated that in 2011, the state paid more than $75 million in taxes on forest preserve and easement lands, spread across about 3.4 million acres, roughly $22 an acre, flowing straight into town, county, and school budgets. In a place like Long Lake, where state land can be more than half the town, that empty green block on the map isn't a fiscal hole. It's often the single biggest taxpayer keeping the school open and the plows running. The wilderness you assume drains the town is quietly paying its bills. 6. The poisoned lakes that came back. Those mirror-still ponds you paddle across, the ones that look eternally pristine. Some of them were, not long ago, effectively dead. Adirondack bedrock is low in the minerals that neutralize acid. So when acid rain rolled in on the wind from Midwestern coal plants, these headwater lakes had no defense. Through the 1970s and 80s, monitoring showed their pH dropping and sulfate climbing until waters like Brook Trout Lake turned too acidic for brook trout to survive. Fish populations crashed, the food web reshuffled toward whatever could tolerate the acid. Then, the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments forced emissions down at those faraway smokestacks, and the lakes slowly began to heal, pH creeping back up, some waters fit for fish again. Paddle them now, and you might spot a small monitoring buoy anchored offshore. That's the tell. This was never untouched wilderness. It was a decades-long open-air experiment in continental pollution, and one of the clearest proofs we've seen that a single law can bring an ecosystem back. 5. The border you'll never see. There's a border running through these mountains that you can cross a dozen times a day and never once notice. It's the blue line, the legal boundary of the Adirondack Park, and unlike a national park, it has no gates, no booths, no welcome arch. It exists only on maps and in statute, but cross it and the rules governing the ground around you quietly change. Inside the line, the Adirondack Park Agency oversees land use with a rulebook the neighboring counties don't follow. Drive north on Route 28, and at some unmarked point, the lakeshore building limits tighten. The development review kicks in, the shoreline protections attach, and the pavement and trees look exactly the same on both sides. For the people who live here, that invisible line decides what they can build, cut, or pave. Crossing it feels less like entering a picnic area, and more like slipping across an international border where every rule changes and no sign ever says so. Powerful, consequential, and completely invisible. 4. The kid who invented American wilderness. In the early 1920s, a young man named Bob Marshall was thrashing his way off-trail through the spruce and bog of the Adirondack High Peaks, and more or less inventing a movement as he went. Born in 1901, Marshall and his brother George set out to climb the major high peaks systematically, helping seed the whole culture of the 46ers who chase those summits today. But the peaks did something bigger to him. Bushwhacking trackless ridges near Marcy and the Seward Range convinced him that wild, roadless land was worth protecting for its own sake. Not for its timber, not for its ore. In 1935, he became a co-founder of the Wilderness Society, carrying that Adirondack-forged conviction into national policy, and his ideas fed straight into the Federal Wilderness Act of 1964. People assume America's wilderness ideal came out of the Western Rockies and Sierra. A good piece of it was born right here, in a 20-year-old slogging through New York spruce. 3. Protection written into the Constitution. The rules that keep the Adirondacks wild aren't agency policy some commissioner can rewrite. They're in the state constitution. At New York's 1894 Constitutional Convention, delegates, fed up with decades of reckless logging, fires, and damage to the watersheds feeding the canals and cities downstate, wrote that forest preserve land here shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. No sale, no lease. No timber cutting, except by narrow exceptions the voters themselves approve. That forever wild clause is stronger than almost any ordinary law, and it has held since 1894. Here's what that means on the ground. To build a new highway across Forest Preserve, or to swap even a small parcel, New York has to amend its constitution by statewide referendum. A single decision about one Adirondack trail can land on the ballot for the entire state to vote on. When you feel the constraint on a trail near Marcy, no road, no logging, you're not bumping into a rule, you're bumping into the Constitution itself. 2. The 130,000-person wilderness. Picture the space between Adirondack trailheads as nothing but unbroken forest. Now put people in it, because they're there. About 130,000 people live inside the Blue Line year-round, in towns like Saranac Lake, Tupper Lake, and Old Forge, with hospitals, school districts, grocery stores, and full main streets running entirely inside the park. On top of that, the region draws more than 10 million visits a year. Skiers at Whiteface, paddlers on the Fulton Chain, hikers mobbing the high peaks, enough to jam those small downtowns solid in season. And yet, it can still feel empty. Spread 130,000 residents across 6 million acres, and that's about 46 acres per person. That's the paradox that defines the place. It isn't wilderness beside a town, or a town beside wilderness. It's both, laid directly on top of each other, so completely that road salt, wastewater, and housing prices become conservation problems. And the school bus route runs through habitat, which sets up the one fact that ties this whole thing together. 1. A giant inhabited wilderness experiment. We end where it all began, with the whole question of what this place even is. Every fact in this countdown has been circling one strange truth. Every national park you can name works by keeping people out. Draw a line, remove the towns, preserve the empty. The Adirondacks were built to do the opposite. New York created the Forest Preserve in 1885, and in 1894 it locked Forever Wild into the state constitution. Then, instead of clearing everyone out, it drew a blue line around 6 million acres that already held towns, farms, mines, railroads, and people, and simply declared the whole mosaic a park. That's why nothing here matches the postcard. The pale summits are billion-year-old dome rock, still rising. The mirror lakes were poisoned and healed. The straight trails are dead railroads. The rustic camps are Vanderbilt mansions. The empty forest pays the town's taxes, hides a rare thrush, and grew back from clearcuts. One man ran a town of one on the Cold River. 130,000 people run real towns inside the same boundary. None of it's a contradiction. It's the experiment. The Adirondacks are a 140-year-old test of a question nobody else dared ask at this scale. Can a place be genuinely wild and genuinely lived in at the same time? Schools, highways, moose, and constitutional wilderness all inside one line. The fights over shoreline homes and timber and housing aren't signs it's failing. They are the experiment still running. The thing hiding in the Adirondacks was never one secret in the woods. It's the woods themselves, and the bargain we struck to live inside them. After 35 facts about the Adirondacks, the hermit's town of one, the lakes that came back from the dead, which one got you? Drop it in the comments. Subscribe and like to keep exploring America's geography. And go watch our Appalachians episode next. See you in the next one.